The first part of every turn is the untap step, though before you actually untap your permanents, you first phase in all permanents you control that were phased out. Then, if the day-night cycle has been introduced to the game, you check whether it should change, transforming all daybound and nightbound permanents at the same time. After that, all your permanents that are able to untap do so. Note that no players gain priority during the untap step, which means no player can respond to any of these actions with spells or abilities. Because of this, any abilities that would trigger during this step are delayed until the upkeep. At the beginning of the upkeep step, delayed triggers from the untap step and abilities that trigger during your upkeep will be put on the stack. This is the first time during your turn that any player has priority, meaning there's no way to cast a spell on your turn before the triggering of upkeep abilities. This is also when you can activate any activate only during your upkeep abilities. After all these abilities resolve and players all pass priority, you enter your draw step, where you draw your card for turn, assuming nothing is preventing this. Then, at the beginning of your draw step, abilities trigger and players gain priority, regardless of whether or not there actually are any of those abilities. This allows players an opportunity to make you discard the card you just drew before you have a chance to cast it in your main phase. Though if that spell is an instant or has flash, you can respond by casting it. After all spells and abilities resolve and all players pass priority, then you enter your pre-combat main phase. And all abilities that trigger at this phase go on the stack, which gives players priority to respond. Once the stack is empty again, you gain priority. Note, if no abilities go on the stack this way, then your opponents do not gain priority at this phase until you put a spell or ability on the stack or attempt to pass to your combat phase. On either of your main phases, you are allowed to play a land, or more with an appropriate card. Playing lands is a special action, meaning it doesn't use the stack, and because of that, can't be responded to. This means even if you have extra lands you can play on a turn, you can play all of them without passing priority. If a land entering the battlefield causes an ability to trigger, however, that will give your opponents the chance to respond. The main phase is the only time you can cast permanent and sorcery spells, unless they have flash, or you have another card letting you ignore this restriction. Once you pass priority to go to your combat phase, your opponents have an opportunity to cast spells and activate abilities while still in your main phase. This is the final opportunity of all players before, at the beginning of combat, abilities will trigger. The combat phase is made up of 5 steps. Beginning of combat step. This is the last opportunity that vehicles can be crewed in order to attack, and that creatures can be tapped or pacified to prevent attacking or removed from the battlefield in order to prevent attack triggers. Declare attacker step. Choose which creatures you are going to attack with all at once, making sure all attack restrictions are met and any prison effects are paid. After attackers are declared, all players have an opportunity to cast spells and activate abilities. Declare blockers step. Defending player chooses which creatures will block and how they will do so, meeting all blocking restrictions. Then, the attacking player will choose the order each attacking creature will deal damage to the blocking creatures. Once again, all players have an opportunity to cast spells and activate abilities. Combat damage step. Now the attacking player decides how damage will be dealt to blocking creatures. Then first strike damage happens. Once again, players each gain priority in sequence. Then regular combat damage happens. End of combat step. Finally, abilities that trigger at end of combat trigger, and effects that last until end of combat expire. Each player gains priority in sequence for a 5th time, no wonder playing a game on Arena takes so long. Then creatures are removed from combat and you proceed to the post-combat main phase. And all abilities that trigger at this phase will go on the stack. Every main phase besides the first in a turn is considered a post-combat main phase. This is true even if your combat phase has been skipped, or if you have more than 2 main phases. You have the opportunity once again to play lands and cast sorcery speed spells during your post-combat main phases. Once you pass priority to enter your ending phase, your opponents gain priority. This is the last time a player can respond before at the beginning of your end step abilities will trigger. After you pass through your post-combat main phase, you enter the first step of the ending phase, the end step. Not confusing at all, right? This is when, at the beginning of your end step, abilities trigger, including delayed triggers such as from sneak attack. Whether any abilities trigger or not, players gain priority during the end step. If a permanent with an ability that triggers at the beginning of the end step enters the battlefield during this step, that ability won't trigger until the next turn's end step. Once the stack is empty and all players pass priority, you move to the cleanup step. If you have more cards in hand than your maximum hand size, which is usually 7, you have to discard until you no longer exceed that limit. Then, simultaneously, all damage marked on permanents is removed, and until end of turn and this turn effects end. Generally, this would be the last action for the turn, and no players gain priority during the cleanup step. However, the game checks if any state-based actions would be performed or if any abilities would trigger during the cleanup step. This means if any until end of turn effects ending would cause a creature to die, for example, it does so, which will trigger any abilities for that creature dying. Similarly, if discarding cards in your cleanup step would trigger abilities, such as Madness, those abilities are put on the stack now. If any such abilities trigger, this opens up players to each gain priority in the cleanup step, being able to cast spells and activate abilities. Once the stack is empty again and all players pass priority, this will trigger an additional cleanup step. This means you will once again make sure you don't have more cards in hand than your maximum hand size and remove damage and until end of turn effects. Cleanup steps will indefinitely reoccur if triggered abilities or state-based actions continue to happen. This means there is no way to pass through your turn with more cards in hand than your maximum hand size. Once your final cleanup step has passed, proceed to your opponent's beginning phase. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.